Hi everyone. In this video, in this talk, I want to talk about Sire marriages, their connection with the female body, focusing on theories concerning body politics, and I will look at some Persian cultural productions. So first, I will talk a little bit about body politics and the theories regarding the female body and um, how society often projects ideas of difference onto the human body by placing the body in prescribed roles that determine how it should behave socially and politically. And dichotomy is based on gender, ability, aesthetic, age, and sexual identity are among others that highlight the instability of public and private borders and subject the body to recognition or discrimination based on the body's proximity to those boundaries. Now, transgressing the limits of these dichotomies or identities can deprive an individual of the right to claim of corporeal agency. The realm of the political includes issues of personal agency associated with the body itself, including but not limited to sexual violence, contraception, reproduction, and personal aesthetic or style, and operate as markers of status and power. Within the purview of human existence, contemporary societies often organize and politicize bodies based on their sex and race and seek to limit or to grant access to political power to those bodies based on their specific occupations, religions, and intimate relationships. A body's departure from its pre-arranged sexual, racial, or gender roles could subject it to physical, emotional, and sexual assault. And since the female body is disproportionately victimized by sexual violence, it is therefore marked as vulnerable and subordinate. Such a categorization associates the female body with excessive, frivolous emotion and paints it as unsuitable for the production or pursuit of some knowledge. Because bodies provide the foundation upon which societies are built, it is necessary to study how crossing the borders of private and public boundaries subject women to policing and stigmatization, potentially robbing them of their subjectivity and agency, and to analyze the ways in which the dismissal of the fluidity of a woman's bodily existence in mainstream politics compounds issues of exclusion and autonomy for women who seek to appear in the public sphere. So focusing on the intersection of gender and other societal constructs broadens the scope of what is studied in regards to body politics, formal and informal marriages in Iran, sex work, and Sire marriages basically in modern Iran and in Iranian literature and film, as well as the processes of nation building and modernization, among others. Under Iran's civil law, there are two recognized types of marriages: formal marriage or nikah, and temporary marriage or sire marriages or mota. While formal marriage establishes a more enduring union with the intention of creating a family, temporary marriage um, is often of a shorter duration. In many ways, it is a form of concubinage and requires a set of regulations and negotiations about the length, monetary exchange, and the nature of sexual relationships. These Sikh marriages have had a long history in the Arabian Peninsula, and they were practiced in the region even before the emergence of Islam, which positions it as a cultural practice rather than a religious tradition. In this type of marriage, there is no divorce because the union dissolves at the end of a designated term, while the temporary purpose of while the temporariness or the temporary feature of the nature of the marriage makes the marriage mainly for the purpose of sexual gratification, mainly for and exclusively for men. The purpose of formal marriage or nikah is primarily family establishment and procreation. Despite the legality and legitimization of both marriages in Shia Islam in Iran, Sikh marriages carry a social stigma that marks the couple, but more specifically the woman who enters the marriage and the institution itself also as inferior. A Sikh wife does enjoy certain liberties, autonomy to engage in personal, non-sexual relationships, maintain outside interests, leave the household without the husband's permission, live in a city where the husband does not reside, or even take a job. Nonetheless, because the practice is viewed as taboo in society, most Sikh women often suffer from vulnerability and insecurity, and most men keep their Sikh relationships secret. Now, questioning how the body is used as a battlefield for power gives us room to analyze the fluidity of the inclusion and privilege, and conversely, ostracism and marginalization. How do societies decide who is or who is not included in society? How should the state approach its response to the growing unanswered political demands of the bodies that cannot or will not remain within normative boundaries? How do physical representations of difference inform power dynamics? Where when bodies are policed and regulated, does that impact society? How so? In what ways do those bodies that transgress normative boundaries and state boundaries challenge power relations on the national stage? What role do moral perspectives and virtues play in the society's regulation and protection of bodies? Because bodies are the bedrock upon which society stands, exploring how and why women's bodies, including these Sikh women's bodies, engage with the state and society is crucial to our understanding of what constitutes a transgressing body, how the body is excluded, marginalized, or threatened, how is it that social and moral norms inform political attitudes toward that body, and how does that body threaten normative narratives? Now, while the value of Sikh marriages has fluctuated throughout history in Iran, the social stigma of these marriages has never disappeared. A Sikh wife, as I mentioned, does enjoy certain liberties in modern Iran. However, the gender roles and the cultural view of the Sikh marriage as taboo remains the same, which further contributes to the continuing vulnerability, invisibility, and insecurity of these women, especially because most men in these relationships keep the relationship secret. Now, contrary to the stereotypical view of Sikh women as invisible and liminal figures, in this talk, I want to show you that Sire women often defy this categorization. While they live on the margins of the society, they also occupy a significant space in the social imaginary of the dominant culture. And this social position speaks to Sire women's symbolic and sexual power. Now, Sire is in the literature and film and in the cultural productions of Iran, Sire has been used in various contexts with different connotations, and my research shows that there are 15 different connotations and categories that they can be put in. So here I want to talk about the 15 most prevalent foci of Sire in the cultural productions of Iran, specifically under the Pahlavi regime. So the works that focus on Sire portray the relationship between Sire marriages and the clerics. They demonstrate the author's opinion on the moral value of the Sire. They draw parallels between Sire and sex work. They show the cleric's exploitation of Sire women as a source of income. They illustrate the impact of this type of marriage on children of Sire women. They highlight the public mistreatment and abuse of Sire women. They show the advantages of Sire for some women. They do also focus on men who enter Sire marriages, and they do show Sire within pilgrimage zones and the relationship between Sire and khans, masters, overlords, and property owners. Some of these works examine the widowed women who enter Sire, or some others focus on divorced women who contract Sire, and others still about sex workers who engage in Sire. Also, there are works focusing on maids who are forced into Sire, and finally, the use of Sire to save family and to save face and family honor. Now, this is a quick analysis of, the Pahlavi era cultural productions, and we see that Sire characters frequently enter socio-sexual relationships with men out of economic obligations. That is what these works portray. However, the truth is that that Sire relationships are formed due to a web of factors rather than simple financial dependency. Other factors, to just reiterate a few of them, include saving the family's honor by being able to call oneself married and believing in the heavenly reward associated with the Sire. Or for some stories and novels, the female body is disciplined and policed through various sociocultural, political, and religious institutions to maintain male dominance, satisfy sexual pleasure, and preserve social status. Now, the female body is the site where a multitude of sociocultural experiences and powers are inscribed and negotiated. And this includes the women's bodies as well. So we need to understand temporary marriage in Iran, not just as an institution, but also as a set of practices, identities, and meanings that have transformed over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. So since within this context of gender inequality and segregation, temporary marriage can be situated at the intersection of submission and resistance, transgression and compliance, obstacles and possibilities. So within this theoretical framework, as I mentioned, I am working with the theories of body politics and the female body, and using works such as Susan Bordeaux and Sandra Bartke or Janet Wolf and Monique Wittig. According to the theories of body politics and these feminist theories, social relations between men and women are an embodiment of gendered servitude, which can translate into physical and economic obligations for women and often defines womanhood in the eyes of many in that way. As such, the female body becomes a site for competing ideologies and policies, and it is through the constant influences of the discursive strategies of the culture that the female body becomes and is defined in the way that it is. So from the literature of the periods that I have read, the Pahlavi era and under the Islamic Republic, and some of the films, um, they all simultaneously manifest female body as the locus of socio-cultural policing and a site of social inscriptions as docile, subordinate, and passive. So with sociocultural codes and power structures inscribed on the female body, cultural productions illuminate how the female body is produced through an interaction of disciplinary institutions and governments within a patriarchal system. So viewing the female body as a site of sociocultural, religious, and political inscriptions translates into understanding how the female body functions as a sex object, particularly as an object of male desire that is always controlled. Now, the female characters that I will examine shortly, however, they do not necessarily conform to these disciplinary expectations. They These female characters sometimes decorporealize the female body, and such that the female body is viewed as not only socioculturally constructed, but simultaneously able to disrupt the existing discourses and to subvert the especially the body-mind dualism that comes up in many of these works, in order to create a non-patriarchal female embodiment. So these works also illustrate that there is always the possibility of resistance, because identity formation, as Judith Butler also argues, is an outcome of acts of repetition, bodily gestures, and movements that create an illusion of a gendered self, which is in fact fluid and ever-changing. So while the female body is an embodiment of sociocultural, political, and historical possibilities that are part of the regulatory discourse of the larger power structure, it also highlights the fact that the female body has agency. So despite the fact that, for example, these characters I will examine are portrayed as invisible, liminal, vulnerable, and often stigmatized as Sire women, they are simultaneously depicted as exercising a certain power by occupying a significant space in the social imaginary of the dominant Iranian culture. It is through this dual position that they disrupt the standard narratives about Iranian women and their sexuality, particularly in the context of Sire. So that is why these Sire women pose threats to the status quo and hold power over men and create anxiety over male sexuality in Iranian society, even while they themselves are marginalized and subject to violence. Now, even though I position myself here within the feminist discourses about the body politics, I'm not intending to forget about Iranian feminism and Iranian feminist discourses. So that is also in the back of my mind, and I include in my analysis. So let's look at some of these cultural productions and works. I would like to give some examples from some of the novels, short stories, and um, and films from modern Iran. I'll begin with Tehran Makhuf by Murtaza Mushfaq Kazemi, where he approaches the female sighe or sex workers' bodies as a canvas on which the transitioning sociocultural and political scripts of the declining Qajar era and the nascent Pahlavi regime are projected. Now, these scripts place women in a position of subordination and transgression um, against these scripts place women in positions of subordination, and transgressions against these positions culminate in women's loss of agency and subjectivity. The novels Tehran Makhuf or Horrid Tehran, as it's been translated, the novel examines matters of personal agency linked to the female body, including reproduction, abortion, and venereal diseases. It is important to note the significance of the female body in the novel's world and how sociocultural and political institutions degrade women's bodies, and how this degradation complicates women's agency. Now, the focus of the novel is on women's suffering at the hands of a patriarchal system in the years surrounding the 1921 coup d'etat, a system that considers women as properties to be owned or commodified, or commodities to be used, exchanged, and sold. In the novel, fathers, husbands, and lovers all view women as objects of desires incapable of autonomous subjectivity. Female characters such as Effat and Mahin are seen only as bodies capable of serving male sexual desire and satisfying male sexual urges, while men dissociate women's bodies from their minds, basically dehumanizing them. The novel's portrayal of women's lack of education, ignorance, and superstitious beliefs also reflect the unfavorable sociopolitical conditions that provide men with easy access to the exploitation of female bodies, specifically the bodies of sighe/sex worker women. It also phrases the female body as a site of resistance to oppression, where power is reclaimed via counter discourses. And through the embodiment of Effat, Mahin, and some other women characters in the brothel, Moshfegh Kazemi shows that the female body is a site of power and social inscriptions that simultaneously threaten the logic behind the status quo. Whereas these women are living on the margins of society, vulnerable and stigmatized, the novel highlights their dominance in the social and cultural imaginary. In one way or the other, almost all the men who are fascinated with these women rely on them for pleasure. Although these women are seen as non-thinking objects by the male characters and are heavily stigmatized in the novel, in several moments in the story, these women subvert the status quo and resist the dominant discourse of women's so-called proper place in society. While they occupy a particular space in the sociocultural imaginary that subjects them to the surveillance of the male gaze and in policing and regulation and disciplinary actions. In fact, it is women who control that gaze and therefore in some ways instigate the actions of the men who control the entire society. Now moving to Jamalzadeh and his Masume Shirazi, I want to emphasize that Jamalzadeh illustrates in this novel the ways that the various, again, sociopolitical and religious institutions devalue women as simply reproductive, biological, corporeal, rather than autonomous subject. So these techniques of devaluing women rely on the instrumentalization of female bodies to the advantage of patriarchal social institutions. Jamalzadeh's central character is a sireh slash sex worker Masume, who's an objectified woman struggling at the nexus of various misogynistic institutions. Masume also, just like Efat and Mahin in the previous novel, occupies a particular social position within the novel's fantastical patriarchal world, where men conjure cultural ideals of feminine body and feminine beauty to which women must conform or risk rejection. Masume's original suitors eventually grow to despise her when she becomes sick and frail, believing she no longer conforms to those patriarchal standards of femininity. However, the truth is that this masculine construction of ideal femininity, as Sandra Bartke writes, quote, is an artifice and achievement and mode of enacting and reenacting received gender norms which surface as so many styles of the flesh, end quote. Allowing Masume to bring her complaints of a high-ranking cleric who exploited her body and exposed her to violence to the divine court, and at the same time to challenge God, Jamalzadeh provides Masume with a space in order to subvert this gender discourse of femininity constructed by patriarchal social institutions. Only within the realm of the divine court is Masume provided with a voice and subsequently with access to justice. To have a voice, Masume has to critique the normative sociocultural, religious, political scripts. Hence, she directs her complaints about the world around her and the people in it to the divine source without the patriarchal interference she would experience on earth. Interestingly, God responds to Masume by condemning the hypocritical cleric, which provides her with justice. The novel's ending reflects Jamalzadeh's broader religious and social critiques. He highlights the dynamics that underlie the manner in which fundamental gendered and sexual relationships are structured by patriarchy in a society where sireh slash sex work is situated as a tool of male dominance. The novel critiques the ways that the socio-political power structure minimizes the agency of a sireh woman or a sex worker woman who men have historically exploited for profit. Now, moving to 1960s, 1967, Ebrahim Golestan's Safar Esmat or Esmat's Journey, I read the story of the sireh slash sex worker Esmat as a social outsider whose hypersexualized body transgresses its boundaries, posing threat to the dominant social discourses concerning sociocultural, political, and religious institutions. Because of these powerful transgressions against the Iranian social order, society disciplines her under the facade of religious or cultural sireh. The story highlights the relationship between sireh, the clerics, and clerics' exploitation of sireh women as a source of income in pilgrimage zones, which makes it tantamount to sex work. Golestan draws a picture of his protagonist, Esmat, who, after escaping from sex work, begins to engage in domestic and sex work as a sireh wife in a shrine with the help of a sayyid. Her lifestyle as a sex worker gives us a picture of the results of the country's moral and socioeconomic corruption, women's lack of education, and the introduction of the female sexual freedom in 1960s Iran. Yet her transformation into a sireh wife with the aid of the Sayyid provides us with a critical commentary on the picture of sociocultural and religious conditions of the time. The short story, draws attention to the discord between female empowerment and power in the context of sireh sex work. Questioning both social and religious hypocrisy, it is important to decide whether the Sayyid's legalization of sex work through sireh helps diminish its social stigma and creates a more egalitarian perspective for Ismat, or whether it perpetuates the same victimization under the facade of some sort of religious or moral regulation or legal regulation. By the end of the story, it becomes apparent that not only does the Sayyid fail to eliminate Ismat's symbolism as otherness, but he is very much dependent on her. Ismat becomes the primary exoticized and eroticized constituent of the Sayyid's own fantasy life, and by extension, all men's. Similarly, Sadegh Jubak's Sang Sabur in 1966, The Patient Stone, illustrates the changing perceptions of the intersection between women's increased public presence and patriarchal views, specifically those that perceive women as objects of desire and signifiers of the potential for corruption and disarray. Through Gohar's murder and physical disappearance, what is veiled or absent gradually becomes present and apparent, namely female sexuality and its mirroring of female subjectivity. Gohar's absence only highlights her visibility in the novel, insofar as every character ends up speaking about her through speaking about her sexuality. Furthermore, since only her sexuality is referred to, her physical absence not only reflects male fetishization of her veiled or absent body and sexuality, but also stands as a comment on her repressed subjectivity, that is, her life, her experiences, her thoughts, and her works. Gohar is not provided a voice throughout the novel, only other characters speak about Gohar's life. As literary scholar Farzaneh Milani has suggested, and I'm quoting, for centuries, veiling not only curtailed Iranian women's bodily expression, but also inhibited their verbal self-expression. Their public silence was long legitimized, spiritualized, fetishized, and idealized. The traditional Iranian beauty appears to be made more alluring by not saying anything. Silence was one of her hallmarks, end quote. So we might question what else male characters are fascinated with other than dominating Gohar sexually, given that the majority of the references to her are sexual in nature. Can we suggest that it is in fact male sexuality that is suppressed and only released by talking about Gohar? And by proxy, can we not conclude that female sexuality mirroring female subjectivity is being subjugated? How do men's sexual fantasies reflect or not the realities of women's lives? What then is suppressed? Gohar's sexuality or her subjectivity? Now, moving to beyond Pahlavi era, to the 2000s under Islamic Republic, I'm going to look at two cinematic works because I could not find literary works that focus mainly on Sireh women. So I look at Behruz Afkhami's Shokaran or Hemlock, which merges the law with religion and dramatizes the political as the personal, all as a part of individuals' pursuit of morality. Shokaran reflects how the social and moral corruption of the time is mapped onto a woman's body and how a woman's body has to be eliminated to eradicate this corruption. Through highlighting the role of Sighe marriages in the precarious balance of religiosity and modernity, Afkhami displays the complex aspects of Sighe marriages and the detrimental effects the practice has, particularly on the personal lives of women, but also on society at large. Important themes that emerge from viewing Sighe in this way include the manipulation of religion, the societal and religious double standards imposed on women, marriage as an institution versus an intimate relationship, and politicization of the personal. Afkhami portrays Sima, the Sighe wife protagonist, as simultaneously desired and despised, both at the margins and the center. Sima, who is socially peripheral, becomes symbolically central when she poses a threat to Mahmud's nikah marriage. Shokaran exposed some social problems, including double standards in Sighe marriages and how religious regulations are used as a facade to justify social injustice. Afkhami portrays a realistic treatment of love, sexuality, and women through Sima's body, which becomes the catalyst for symbolic struggle between cultural, social, religious, political, and sexual forces. In Shokaran, Afkhami focuses on the government-endorsed practice of Sighe and the inherent double standards produced by temporary marriage in modern Iran. He sets out to portray the differing struggles of men and women when balancing modernity and traditionalism. Since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the plight of women in particular to reconcile the two contrasting elements of modernity and traditionalism became more severe as the state implemented laws that dictated how women were to balance religious customs with modern ideals of women's rights and opportunities. A similar thing happens in Mohammad Hossein Farahbakhsh's Zindagi Khususi or Private Life, produced in 2011. Farahbakhsh dramatizes the intersection of the private and the political as the male protagonist, a devout, high-ranking reformist politician, Ibrahim, struggles to come to terms with his sexual desires. In order for his religious views, including his views on Sighe, to align with his new desire to have extramarital sex, the female protagonist must pay a price. Ultimately, the female protagonist's body must be erased for the male protagonist's moral corruption to remain secret. Farahbakhsh lays bare the religious and political hypocrisy and gender-related double standards inherent in the practice of Sighe. The film demonstrates the inimical power of patriarchy to willingly eliminate a female body in order to protect and maintain the male prerogative while precariously balancing political ideals, personal desires, and religious beliefs in a society. The storyline follows an influential and famous man who gets entangled in a secret relationship that he never intended to evolve into a permanent attachment, but the woman's pregnancy and the impending birth of the child ruins his plans. To solve his problems, he kills them both, just like what happens in Shokaran too. While this might be cliche plotline because we have Shokaran as well, the film's political content and the depiction of the Sire are innovative. The representation of the high-profile reformist politician who mobilizes Sire to his benefit is also very innovative. The film portrays Sire women only as objects of male desire that can quickly be discarded after use. While Ibrahim, the male protagonist, continues his life, the female protagonist, Parisa, is eliminated, which speaks to the threat she poses to the security of the man's marital life, the nikah life, and political reputation as well. Farah Bakhsh highlights the internal gendered double standards within the government-endorsed Sire practice, calling attention to objectified, highly desired women who are not just discarded but obliterated once they begin to threaten patriarchal structures. Zendegi Khususi lays bare the hypocrisy of reformists who lay claims to democracy and liberalism by pretending to endorse women's rights, but who fail to follow through with their promises and end up sacrificing others to protect themselves. It is a political commentary on the legacies of Iran's 1979 revolution. The film breaks political and sexual taboos, while also raising questions and problems of its own. It's a film that includes undercurrents of romance while delivering ideological and political messages. The film depicts the complicated Iranian political arena where politics cannot be reduced to a dichotomy between reformists and hardliners. So with all these cultural productions and discussing them in the context of body politics and Sire marriages, I hope that I have made it clear that while these women in these cultural productions that I have examined are portrayed as marginal and invisible and vulnerable, they each, in their own turn, pose some sort of threat to the status quo and the normative hegemonic discourses. So to maintain those discourses, then they are eliminated from the society.